Hey everybody, it's your old pal Nonagon here. Today I wanted to go over config files in the fat-free framework and kind of loosely structuring your app in a better way than just kind of throwing everything in one config file. So we're starting here with the base of the database example that I gave in another video. So like we have our database, that's getting created here. We have to define the autoloader. We have a few routes, nothing too complicated or crazy. But as you can imagine, during building of an app, you might have 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 routes. You might have a bunch of different config file or different configurations in there for debugging, and here we have autoload, and maybe you're setting locales or languages and a whole bunch of other things. This index file can start getting pretty big, so what we need to do is start throwing things in a config file away from here. So in general, what you do for a config file is you create a new folder for config, and then in here you create a new file. So I'll show one example of a rudimentary config file that you can make, and then I'll show you one that fat-free has the ability to parse and ultimately make things a lot easier. So we'll just do a regular old config.php, and what you can do is just do something like return, and this is one trick that I didn't learn for many years until many years later as a PHP developer, but if you have a file and you return something, what will happen is, in a second, I'm going to do something right here where I'll do like config equals require, and then config.php. So this config will return this. It's almost like this file's kind of like a giant function, and it returns something in the end. It will return this array, and then config becomes that array. Kind of an interesting thing, and I've used it in several other instances where I just want to like stop execution of that one file, but maybe not exit. And so that will just stop, get you out of that included file or whatever. Don't have to exit. You can keep going on with your program. So anyway, you'll notice in here we have, a database user. Let's get that out of there. So we'll just say db user is fat-free user, and db pass is testing 1, 2, 3. So that's very basic. But now what I can do is I can do config db user. I know you Vim people are probably hating me right now because I'm doing that. db pass. So now you can see like I'm not actually storing that in there. One other benefit of doing it this way is it's really important. Please remember this. It's really important to put your configurations in a spot that will not be tracked by Git or Mercurial or Bazarre, Subversion, whatever. Do not track these files. You do not want to have sensitive credentials being thrown in and out of a repo or whatever, because repos can become compromised. I've seen private repos accidentally made public, and then suddenly their API keys and database passwords, databases, other credentials, all now compromised because that was an accident that happened. So, but in order to prevent that, if you never put the file in there in the first place, you'll be fine. So what I typically do is, like in this case, I'll just create this or copy this file, and then I'll just rename it to config sample. Just name it sample testing. So now what I can do is in my Gitignore, I'll add config.php. So now you can see it's grayed out here, at least in VS Code. Your IDE may show something different, but it means that this is not going to get committed. But this can get committed and it doesn't matter because it's just test data or whatever. It will just kind of give you like an overview of what to do about it. So anyway, now we have our config here, and that's all done and taken care of, and then it just starts, going through and executing all this stuff. I could do things like auto load. I could put, auto load path controllers, and then just remember everything, and it ends in a slash in fat free. So now, I technically could do config auto load path, and you can see like I'm trying to get some of this stuff out of here. One other thing that you can do is you can have a services file. And in here, all it simply is doing is you're just moving around code to help keep it in one spot. So our index file here, we have as part of an application, the services are things that it like relies on in order to function, but it's not like PHP code specific. It usually is something that interfaces with something else. For instance, like in our example app here, we have a database. Well, it's not PHP but PHP needs to interact with the database. So that kind of becomes a service that we could use. So now what I could do is actually take all of this guy and put it in our services file. And then right here, I could do require config services.php. Okay, so we're starting to get a little more organized now. So this auto load thing, it's still in here. It's not really helping out because this config file is just an array. It's not like getting stuff out of here. I still have all these routes here. So this is one idea that you could do with this config.php. It's better than nothing, that's for sure. But there are ways to improve that as well. So we'll leave our services the way it is, but we could have something in here that is specifically built in for fat-free. And it could be this wonderful thing called config, and then we'll just give it the path. We'll give it a very similar path here. config.ini. So now what's the difference with config.ini? Well, let me show you. If you come over to the fat-free documentation over here, you can see that it allows, so there's globals, routes, maps, and redirects. Primarily what I use it for is globals and routes. You can see here this kind of F3 set. You can set this and set that and set that and set that. Or you can do it in a configuration file with all this fun stuff in there. And it means the same thing. So, if we're going along with that idea, so now we have auto load, right? Auto load equals, and then we can do controllers. And then let's say we need debug. Debug value of 3 means it's like super debug mode. Value of 0 means nothing. And this is a great segue for something really quick. It reminds me. One thing that has always gotten to me and always bit me in the butt when I was working on an app, maybe with something that made a lot of queries or a large import or something like that. By default, fat-free will log every single query to the database, which is great if you're in developer mode. But if you're in production mode, that can really quickly eat up a lot of memory. So this is what I do. In config, I could do something like environment equals development. And then in my services file, I could do something like if, let's type it right, environment equals development. Wow, developerment. I'm awesome today. So then I'll do something called dblog false. This is really important. This will turn off the log. What I really meant to do was do this. So if it's not development, then shut off the log. If you had staging or whatever, you could keep it on, but this is just an example. So shut off the log and then add it to your framework here. So we have development, and that's good for now. We also have that little route section. So now we can start pulling this out. So, and it literally is just copy and paste. Copy, and then paste. Now I don't need this line anymore. And I could do the same thing here. I'll just do this, so it'll be a little quicker. So now those two routes, they're now in here. And they don't need to be defined at all. So get that, and we could do the same thing for this one. So now our file is getting a little smaller. We don't need to set auto load anymore because that's already being set here. We have require. So there's our services. Here's our config file. We don't need this anymore because we're not using that PHP. And we don't want to forget, we could do the same thing here. We could do, so actually what you could do, and what I've seen done in the past, is you create a separate config file for routes. So now I can just come over here, take this guy, put it in here. So now I have a routes file that's self-contained with all its stuff, and I can actually commit this. In this config file, I can not commit this, so I'll add it to my Gitignore config.ini. So now that's not getting moved over. I could do the same thing where I create a sample file, so I can commit the sample file but not the real file. And maybe have some documentation in there like development, staging, production environments, and maybe where to find keys or something like that. So now this is all separated, and our index file is looking pretty good now. We just need to make sure that we have the routes file. One thing I do want to point out is it is kind of important to double check that the file does exist. So for instance, if file, or I like to do this, exists equals false, then die missing config file. In the fat-free base class, there's the read method, which the config method uses. So you'll tell it a path, it will go to the path, it will read the path. If it doesn't read it, it has an error silencing operation on it. So if your file doesn't actually exist, it will just silently skip it. And we don't like that. So this is what I do is, I do something where it checks to see if the file exists, and if it does not exist, it will die, so that it is very clear that it can't find that file. You don't want to assume that certain things are working when they're really not. And you could do the same thing here for routes. And of course, seeing all these routes makes my eyes want to bleed a little bit, so I would take this, for example, I just take this and do config path equals this, and then now I'm just checking for config path, config path. All right, so now we're getting a little more error checking in there. Maybe in a future update, we don't have to do something like this. We don't have to do this not file exists, it will actually throw an error or something like that. But for now, that's what we're doing. So this is getting a lot more organized now and a lot more tidy. There is one other cool thing. So if we hover over here, you can see that there's this allow thing here. Allow is template strings are interpreted. So that's kind of cool. So for instance, this is just a quick example, if I had an environment variable like dbpass equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how am I going to get that in a config so that fat-free can see that? Well, it's actually not that hard if I do this true thing. So config right here, and then I just go true. So in my config.ini, now I can do db user or whatever equals, and then from templating, you could do something like get environment variable db user, and that will actually pull from the environment variable, stick it in this db user thing that we're going to be using in fat-free, and then we can now use that environment variable in there. Pretty neat, right? Continuing on with this idea here of this templating, so if we have something here like environment equals development, well, what if your environment's a little more dynamic? Because this debug thing will be, let's do this. So what if we had, maybe we define something over here. Define environment, and we'll say development. We'll say it's defined out here instead, because you could define a whole bunch of stuff anywhere you wanted. So now we're here in our config.ini file, and we're like, ugh, but we just really need this to reflect, like, if you're in development, do 3, and if you're not in development, do this. So you could do that now that we have templating turned on. So we could do if environment equals development 3, otherwise 0. And now, because this is parsed as a template, now it will just automatically know, oh, it's development, so this value needs to be 3. And then tied with that, oh, this is 3, so now in the services file, we could, do the same thing, whether this is define or the environment, or whatever. We now could actually pull, here we go. Now this equals environment. And it's all a little dynamic. So it's pretty cool what it can do. So hopefully you've learned a couple of fancy tricks in here. Of course, if you want to see more stuff like this, I love subscribers. They're my favorite things. They help keep me motivated to do things. Leave comments, ask questions. Happy to help out. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it.